2, 1.
Good afternoon, I'm Frank Daly, a student with Waldorf University. Today's briefing topic will cover the need for tax incentives and reform legislation for disaster relief nonprofits. As government moves resources to other growing needs, less resources are allocated elsewhere, increasing the need for charitable giving. There's growing evidence that government budget formulation requires nonprofits to fill in the gap. In filling the voids, the nonprofits rely heavily on charitable giving. Tax incentives encourage the type of behavior required to create and sustain nonprofits. 68% of donations for a nonprofit comes from individual donors. That's quite a large share of the revenue source. Because of this, it's vitally important that conditions are set that encourages individual giving. Since the government relies on nonprofits, it only makes sense that government provides incentives for charitable giving. The idea of helping others, or the concept of giving back, has existed throughout history. It's the shorter history in the United States. The late 1800s to 1920 was a period of incredible growth of wealth and progressive ideas. Social activism grew as well as political reform. With newfound prosperity, many people sought ways to give back. With the emerging importance of nonprofits providing valuable services where the government cannot, it has become vitally important that tax incentives and tax reform legislation be passed to create an environment for increased charitable giving. During this briefing, we will occasionally refer to the American Red Cross as an example of a disaster relief nonprofit. The Red Cross has its origins in Switzerland in the 1800s. An American named Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross in 1881. The nonprofit received its first congressional charter in 1900. Many disaster relief nonprofits rely on corporation giving as part of their revenue. A larger source of revenue comes from ordinary citizens. Disasters are unpredictable. Nonprofits, like the Red Cross, jump in to provide relief and assistance. Relief efforts for Hurricane Katrina were ongoing well into the next calendar year at an extraordinarily high cost. Fortunately, donations to the Red Cross amounted to approximately $2.1 billion to help with those efforts. The point is, donation revenue compared to relief efforts are unpredictable. Donations from ordinary citizens increased dramatically only because of the catastrophic disaster caused by Hurricane Katrina. Gravel, Marples, and Sherlock reported that in 2018, charitable contributions were estimated to be $427.7 billion. Charitable gifts come from four sources: individual contributions, foundations, bequests, and corporations. In 2018, estimates suggest approximately 54% of individual contributions are expected to have received a tax subsidy, a number that can go higher with tax reform. There is an incredible need for Congress to determine how best to use the federal tax code to relieve suffering and promote recovery efforts after natural disasters strike. This effort would significantly contribute to disaster preparedness that can benefit the victims of all future disasters and ease the ever-increasing strain on nonprofits that engage in disaster relief and recovery efforts, such as the American Red Cross. In this briefing, we will review four specific recommendations originally submitted by the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. We are advocating for their consideration for legislation. The United States is blessed with so many nonprofits that wherever disasters may strike, they respond to help people through the trauma and provide a platform for those wanting to help. We urge adoption of the following recommendations to enable tax policy to truly support victims of disasters in the vital work of charitable organizations in times of great need. Recommendation number 1, provide automatic extensions of filing deadlines for tax-exempt organizations in areas that have been designed as affected by natural disasters. In the period immediately following a natural disaster, tax-exempt organizations like the American Red Cross often lack access to print and submit forms that are necessary to complete and file tax returns with the IRS. Providing automatic extensions to tax-exempt entities in areas affected by natural disasters would provide greater certainty, consistency, and clarity to nonprofits than waiting for Congress or the IRS to provide filing deadline extensions after disasters occur. Recommendation number 2. In previous disaster tax relief legislation, tax-exempt organizations were not eligible for tax credit businesses could receive for wages paid to employees while businesses were inoperable after natural disasters. Nonprofits employ about 10% of the workforce in the nation. By extending this temporary tax credit to tax-exempt nonprofit employers, Congress could help these organizations continue to pay regular wages to their employees after disasters strike. This would prevent the unintended consequence of taking away a primary source of income from 10% of working families during a time of greatest need. Recommendation number 3, create a temporary non-itemizer tax deduction for charitable contributions made for disaster relief and recovery. In past disaster tax relief legislation, Congress has temporarily suspended percentage limitations on adjusted gross income for cash contributions made for disaster relief efforts to charitable organizations. Nonprofits providing disaster relief certainly appreciate this provision, and we would encourage it to be included in future disaster tax relief legislation. Before we brief the next recommendation, let's review some data. Individual taxpayers who itemize their deductions can, subject to certain limitations, deduct charitable donations. Gravel, Marples, and Sherlock estimated that in 2019, approximately 13% of taxpayers will itemize deductions. That's a low figure in that 68% of nonprofit donations come from individual donations. Our final recommendation is the creation of temporary, targeted, universal, or non-itemizer deduction that would enable all taxpayers to receive a charitable giving tax incentive when they donate to disaster relief and recovery efforts. The lack of tax incentive for those who do not itemize means that most of these donations will remain very small. We believe that an above-the-line charitable deduction that is temporary, for example 6 months, and targeted, would enable all taxpayers to support their fellow Americans through the country in an immediate and responsible way. As reported by Double the Donation, charitable giving is up by 4.1%, an increase for the 6th year in a row. The point here is Americans give generously to nonprofits. Imagine what the increased statistics would be if our recommendations are enacted, especially when giving is as easy as hitting an app, going online, or texting a number on your cell phone. As we know, the charitable sector plays an important role in society, and donations are an important source of revenues for charities. We understand that current tax laws affect the amount of donations received by nonprofits, and in particular how the sensitivity of donations to taxes varies across different types of nonprofits. Positive changes to tax laws that affect price of giving likely would lead to an increase in giving year over year. We have laid out 4 recommendations for tax reform we believe would benefit the donor, the nonprofit, and the government. Nonprofits play an integral part in conjunction with the government, with nonprofits relying on individual donors for 68% of their revenue. The recommended tax incentives and tax reform would increase revenue for nonprofits such as the American Red Cross and ensure long-term sustained relief efforts for any future natural disaster. I'm Frank Daly, and this was my briefing for Waldorf University. Thank you.